Hello again. So I'd like to move on now to think about some very, very ambiguous chords. Thinking about chords from composers, say Debussy, Szymanowski, Scriabin, we often find these very, very complicated chords of 6 or 7 pitches, and there's no single way of interpreting these chords. They're extremely ambiguous. What I'm going to be zooming in on is some of the moments when these chords change from one complicated chord to another complicated chord, and examining some of the kind of micro pushes and pulls, the diatonic energies that flow between those chords. Chords which often we tell ourselves we really just need to enjoy these for their own moment by moment sonority in a very, very sensuous way. That's essentially how Debussy suggested that we listen to these chords. But quite often when I'm listening to this kind of music, I still feel this sort of diatonic sense of push and pull from one chord into the next, and it's very, very difficult to explain or explore because of the complexity of these chords, where that pull comes from. So I'm going to be developing today a technique for really zooming in on some of the different diatonic drives, as I call them, that are inherent within these chromatic chords, drives which happen often at the same time. So that's a chord from Szymanowski's Third Symphony, Song of the Night. And it's a chord which, we can experience in so many different ways. We can just sit back and enjoy it and let it wash over us. For me, the way that these chords, these kind of chords interchange, still has a sense of tension. It's like the tension's all over the place. There's too much tension. Let's have a look at some of the different tensions that are in there. So this chord is actually a whole tone chord. It's a complete whole tone chord on C as its root, perhaps. Well, the C is in the bass. That doesn't mean that we have to just let it all wash over us and not engage with it diatonically. A whole tone chord like that does have drives within it. It does have a sense of diatonic impulse. For example, there is a C7 chord in there. That sounds strange. If you imagine the C7 chord though as having a flattened fifth, there is a C7 chord in there. There is also a D7 chord in there, an E7 chord in there, an F sharp 7 chord in there, an A flat 7 chord in there, and a B flat 7 chord in there, all together in one big homogeneous gloop. Now, no listener, I imagine, will be listening to that and thinking, I can hear and experience all of those impulses. What you're actually given is quite a confusing mass. And it's a very, very common way of listening to switch off from diatonic listening and just enjoy that lovely sonority of that chord all by itself. But listen to the melody that Szymanowski plays across the top of this chord, and you'll hear how he uses the melody, which just is essentially an unravelling of the harmonies within that individual chord, to bring out these different impulses. He starts off his melody like this. Which outlines an E7, which could well want to pull towards an A. Now it sounds like E7 was obvious from the start, but of course it wasn't. It was only one of 6 drives within that chord. It then moves on to B flat 7, which might well want to resolve to E flat. And it kind of does go briefly to E flat minor. Then it outlines F sharp 7, which is another one of those potential drives contained within that chord, which could well want to move to B, and in fact it kind of does. Then C7. Again, another one of those diatonic impulses there, which could want to move to F. In the event it actually doesn't move to F, it moves to F sharp, but it still could have, it still potentially wanted to. We then have an impulse on D7, moving to G. As if there is some kind of sense of a tonal discharge going on there from that D7. So what Szymanowski's doing there is he's using the melody to tease out all of these different implications that were already there, inherent within this chord. This chord was full of possibilities. We could have chosen, potentially chosen, or perhaps just unconsciously selected to hear one of those drives as being the primary one that we might well want to latch on to, or we could have just allowed them all to wash over us. We could have completely switched off our diatonic ears. I'm going to be suggesting, in the way that we look through more of this Szymanowski piece, that perhaps what we're actually hearing is an overload of drives. but that Szymanowski allows his entire harmonic syntax to constantly allow little discharges of tension from some very, very complicated chords like these, full of driving potential. He will always select one or two drives to discharge their tension, and therefore the music does have this sense of diatonic pull beneath this otherwise extremely impressionistic surface. So what we're aiming for then in this short analysis is to analyse this Szymanowski piece, which is the first movement of his third symphony, which is subtitled Song of the Night, and to build up a graph, a chart, a map of all of the different drives and seeing essentially the space in which they operate and examining and exploring how these individual drives operate. The graph, don't be too scared, looks a little bit like this. Now, this does look obviously quite confusing, and I'll show you slowly, step by step, how we arrive at this, and then consider what this graph can tell us. Let's look at one fairly straightforward chord. It's not a whole tone chord, it's this one. This is a whole tone chord, but with one altered pitch, one raised pitch or lowered pitch, depending on how you look at it. This was a famous chord that Scriabin used, and it was often called the mystic chord. Now, Szymanowski used this chord often, and it appears in this piece quite a bit. Now, there are at least 3 drives within this chord. We could hear this as having a 5/7 drive towards G major. Doesn't sound that straightforward now, but here's the individual pitches that make that drive. That's a D7 chord moving to G. Now if I play the full chord, it sounds a little bit more correct. So we could hear that chord as having that drive within it, and we could hear that drive as the primary one, but there are others as well. I think perhaps for me the strongest one, because it has the C in the bass, is hearing the C7 drive within this chord. Here's the C7 pitches. You'll notice that the G is missing, or perhaps the G is changed into an F sharp. There's the drive and its potential resolution, C7 to F. Now if we hear the chord, it still sounds quite jazzy, quite spicy, but there is still a sense in which that could well act as a C7 wanting to move to an F. An alternative drive would be to hear a potential F sharp 7 drive going to B major. And again, if we now play that in context, it now sounds quite reasonable, like a 5/7 going to 1 in B major. Now the point is that when we just hear this chord in the abstract, it's as if all of those potential hearings are all in there. And I want to be honest about that and not try and do what analysts often do, which is to try and give a single interpretation of a chord and lay all of these out in a graph of the space in which this music is working. Let's see how I do that. Okay then, so here we have what I'm calling a drive analysis graph. It's a graph of all of the individual drives that occur in the first movement of Szymanowski's Song of the Night, his third symphony. And what I'm really looking at now is the way that these drive configurations change and discharge their tensions throughout the piece. You can see how the cycle of fifths goes down the left-hand column there. And you can see how the bar numbers change as we move from left to right. So you'll see from this graph that there are lots of small images within these squares, little symbols. Now these symbols you will find if you have a look on my website, chromatiharmony.com. You'll find on there a key to what these symbols represent if you want a handy guide, but you can work them out by zooming in on them if you wish. So if we zoom into any of these squares, we'll find a little image, a little avatar that represents a dominant 7th type of drive. The basic drive is, say for example in C major, the G7, the dominant 7th. Now, this is given as a square, but a square with nice rounded edges. And the way that I'm working this is that I'm counting round from the bottom left, right the way around clockwise, to give you the natural sense of the tonic, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th of the drive. Quite often composers will flatten, say, a 5th. They might flatten a 3rd, but let's just say they're flattening the 5th in this particular instance. We would have then G, B, D flat represented by this flat edge, and then F. Composers often will sharpen the 5th too. So then we will have G, B, D sharp with a sharpened 5th, and then F. And that's in a sense the key to how I'm using these individual squares. Of course, quite often triads will represent a sense of drive. It's not as strong with triads, and that's why quite often on the graph I wouldn't label every triad, but in certain contexts you might want to label a triad. Well, in that case we will use a triangle. Again, you can flatten any of those angles or you can sharpen them as well. One of the reasons that this piece is a good one to do is because each chord seems to last for quite some time, and there is a very, very clear change of chord. It's not as though there are lots and lots of chord progressions in this piece. There are only actually about 33 spread across the entire movement. But in each individual one of these chord progressions, we can see some kind of discharge of tonal tension occurring. So the way that this works then is that these arrows that move from left to right diagonally downwards always show a sense of tonal resolution. In this case we can see the B flat drive moving down to E flat. Here we can see an F sharp drive moving down to E via B through bars 40 to 51. And a quick look through the entire piece will show you that at every single bar in the entire piece, throughout all of these complicated chords, there is some kind of resolution, some kind of tension discharge going on. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is the different spaces that we move through. So let's zoom in onto the first bar there. Now, what we find there is that we have a drive on every single node of the whole tone scale. We have a drive on C7 with a flattened fifth. We have a drive on D. We have a drive on E. We have a drive on F sharp, B flat, and A flat. One thing that's particularly important is that I'm showing the bass of each chord by using this small dot in the middle of the relevant drive. So you can see how the bass moves throughout the entire piece, from C to A back to C. You can also see how this whole tone collection of drives there in bar 1, which is extremely thick, is recurring at bar 14 and bar 24. And then in fact there is a big period between bar 72 and 80 where there is nothing but this same configuration of drives. However, what changes here is the bass. We can see that the bass moves as it moves through time. The main difference between these two sections is that the first one is intercut with these two different bars, each less systematic than the whole tone bars of bar 1, 14 and 24, and each one allows a sense of progression, a sense of resolution between the individual drives. So for example, in fact the biggest, longest section of drive resolutions occurs right at the beginning through this whole tone space between E down to F, and then a continuation of the break from B flat down to E flat. That's the longest stretch of resolution, and that occurs through alternations of whole tone space with other types of space. Let's have a look at what these other types of space are. Let's zoom in to this bar here, bar 40, which is essentially the end of the whole tone space. We have some continuations with what's happened before. We've got the same F sharp, we've got the same C drives that we had before in the whole tone space, but now rather than these drives being dispersed by whole tones with one square missing each time, we now have two squares between each drive. Well, that's because these drives, for example here, F sharp, A, C and E flat, all represent the 4 different nodes of an octatonic scale. So each octatonic collection, if it's given as a single chord, will have 4 drives in it, each one spaced by a minor third, rather than by a whole tone, as these initial whole tone chords are. What that means then is that this whole tone passage at the beginning becomes an octatonic passage using this C and F sharp as mediators between the two different types of tonal space. And in fact, we find at the end of the piece that this octatonic space becomes much more significant in bar 84 and then again at bar 125. And as we can see, the only way of really resolving through any of these octatonic progressions is to resolve out of them into a new one. So at bar 84 we have drives on D sharp, F sharp, A, C, and then of course E flat is D sharp again. There is no kind of resolution of tension possible between those chords. We have to move out of them. And this is exactly what Szymanowski does. He discharges the tension out of that octatonic scale from F sharp in bar 89 to give us the real big climax of the work. This work climaxes on the chord of E.
leading some commentators to say that this is moving up towards E as the pinnacle moment of the piece, which potentially is in E. Of course, it's not really in that key. In fact, what happens is the discharge here is actually, you can see there's an empty square there, empty except for the dot in the middle, which represents the bass. So we have an F-sharp drive moving to the bass of B. This E chord itself, this triad here, is given in second inversion, which means that it is a big climax onto a second inversion chord and is therefore going to be more like a dominant than a tonic, which shows why there is a drive progression running right the way through that space at bar 89. We have an almost immediate second wave climax at bar 96 here. Now this climax it's not an anticlimax, but it is the opposite of the big climax that we've just heard, because it is a climax onto a complete whole tone progression. Looking then at the broadest arch of the piece, what we can see then is we can see whole tone space, which is mixed with less systematic types of space to produce a constant sense of some kind of buried tonal resolution. This then becomes slightly, I wouldn't say diatonic, but it becomes slightly more diatonic in the sense that these drives are bunched together in this little section here around fifths. D sharp, G sharp, C sharp, F sharp. That's a much more diatonic constellation of drives, even if the actual musical language isn't diatonic. Then we have whole tone purity. And then from this whole tone purity, we start to move through octatonic progressions with these very, very small micro discharges, as if that big discharge from the beginning has now become disaggregated into these very, very small senses of discharge. Small perhaps in the sense that they are very local, but large in the sense that they are the big climaxes of the work.
So hopefully this short video has opened up perhaps a new way of thinking about these intensely chromatic and energetic chords. I'm sure you'll agree when looking at the kind of diagrams that I'm producing that what we're trying to do is to celebrate the ambiguity of these chords. And this type of analysis really shows us just what level of ambiguity is there. This ambiguity needs to be considered from a different perspective, which we'll explore in the next podcast. Because all of these individual drives that I've labelled on these diagrams essentially look as if they all have the same strength, whereas in reality, some of these drives are much, much stronger than others. And that perhaps changes the game slightly. We'll be looking at this kind of theory in the third podcast, where we consider the topic of entropy.